Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
A lot of effort has gone into hiding African Americans' contributions. It's easy to sell poor information and untrue history. And that's about a lot of ethnic groups.
I'm Sarah Fenske. This is St. Louis on the Air. We all know about Dred Scott and Maya Angelou and Chuck Berry. They were unquestionably extraordinary people, Black Missouri residents who make the Show Me State proud. They are among the many lives featured in the new second edition of Extraordinary Black Missourians. It's an updated version of the book first published 8 years ago by Reedy Press, and it contains much more than just the household names you know from your history books. In it, authors John A. Wright Sr., Sylvia A. Wright, and John A. Wright Jr. detail the stories of Black people who did amazing things for our country, for our city, and for our culture, and all of them spent some time living in Missouri. And joining us today to talk about this book and its second edition are two of its authors. So John A. Wright Sr., welcome.
Thank you.
And John A. Wright Jr., thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So, John Sr., I want to start with you. You wrote the first edition of this book, which was published in 2013. What made you interested in a second edition?
Well, the publisher asked us to do a second edition. That's what got me interested in doing a second edition, the publisher.
Had they sold out of the first edition, or they felt that there were some updates?
They felt there was a need, and it could have been updated. Yeah, a number of people had passed away, and so we added some additional photographs to the book, and we added some additional individuals to the book.
Give me an example of a person who made it into this second edition who wasn't in the first.
Bishop Toden, Gordon Chambers. You had Sylvia. Gwen Packnett. Yeah, that's a good one there. Gwen Packnett. Brittany Packnett. And I'm trying to think of the gentleman who's the author. John, you may remember him. I have to get the book in front of me. But we had 9 people. We had Joseph Penny, who was Pennytown founder of Pennytown in the Missouri. And that's another one we added in there. But we put 9 additional people in the book.
And these 9 additional people, were these all people who became famous in the last 8 years, or are some of them ones that maybe could have made the first edition?
They were long gone. They had passed away, like Sylvia Stark left Missouri during slavery, and she ended up in Canada. She was a Pioneer Woman of the Year in 2020. They named her 12. I think they named her Pioneer Woman of the Year, but she had made her reputation long before any of us were born. So Joseph Penny, who found Pennytown after slavery. So these are people who've been around but haven't been recognized.
Okay, so this was an attempt to bring new insight into these people. And John Jr., I understand you joined in for this volume. What brought you on board?
My mother was my dad's proofreader, and she was the one who would double-check to see what sounded well, what didn't, what flowed, what kind of corrections needed to be made. And when she became ill, that kind of left an opening for me to come on in.
And were you an enthusiastic participant in this, or did your father have to twist your arm a little bit?
No, I did not have to have my arm twisted. I was an enthusiastic historian. I have a minor in history from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So I have always been interested. I always liked what they had to say. They always bring in new fun facts about people or things that I didn't know about. It's kind of, it's gone a little bit beyond cool trivia. So because I can see the impact that it could, and its potential.
And I understand you and your father are both longtime educators. Is that a perspective that's important in understanding the way you approach this book?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. Because often the things that are written about or covered in the book become conversation pieces. We find being a teacher of the material that we cover. So I think that it's a great experience. It's been a great experience.
So, John Sr., you were used to having your wife be your proofreader. Was it hard to take corrections from your son?
No. You don't marry your stuff, you know? When you fall in love with it, you got to get divorced from some things when you've noticed you're on the wrong track. So I've always been open to making changes.
That I'm sure makes it much easier to work with you. So, John Jr., I'm sure that was much appreciated. I'm also wondering, though, being in a different generation, did you bring a different perspective to this project and the lens through which it looked at this history?
I think that for me, I was more inclined to defer. One, because we already had a winning formula, and you don't kind of mess with what works. But I do think that that there are certain things that I was able to take notice of to include, like if I thought that was something that might have been overlooked, or maybe a slight addition. But the basic formula has remained the same.
Okay, so this is really your father's baby, as much as you've been excited to be a part of it and have been happy to make those contributions.
Yes.
So looking back on that first edition, and everybody who's been included in edition number 1, edition number 2, John Jr., is there one that really stands out to you as this is one of the most extraordinary stories?
There are a few that I really like. That were mainly tied to the first edition, but I love the stories that I truly enjoyed and really wish they would have gotten a little bit more attention. Mm-hmm. I think this, a number of people my age do not know about who Wendell Pruitt was, what his contribution.
And let's pause there, because I do believe you're right about that. That's somebody who's underappreciated. What is the story of Wendell Pruitt?
Wendell Pruitt was a Tuskegee Airman who came into prominence when he took out a German destroyer. He was St. Louisan. He went to Sumner High School, went to Lincoln University and Jeff City, and then went on to become a Tuskegee Airman. It's funny because he was supposed to have stopped flying. He didn't die in combat. He died training an officer. Training other officers, other pilots. He had complained about the treatment that had been given to the airmen and the planes that they had been given to train others. In fact, I think his sister-in-law was recorded as saying that he thought they were flying death traps, and it led to him being killed in an unfortunate accident training another pilot.
Boy, that is a sad story. And I think part of what's sad about it is that so many of us, if we know that name today, it's in the context of Pruitt-Igoe, which was named after him. But, this life that he had was amazing and goes long beyond this controversial housing project that ended up kind of having a checkered record.
There was even supposed to be a citywide parade for him that kind of got canceled due to bad weather. It was the ceremony had been brought indoors, but the city was going to come out for him when he had come home. It's very unfortunate what had happened to him, but even more so, I think that a number of people my age and younger do not know who he was.
So that's Wendell Oliver Pruitt. John Sr., is this a name that people in your generation would have been much more familiar with? He's just been lost to history.
Yeah, I think so. We were more in tune to the things of that nature. But one, when John was mentioning of one of the pilots for Tuskegee, Charles Anderson, grew up on a farm in University City. None of the history books on University City mention his name. He's a gentleman who was in the plane with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a driving force in getting the Tuskegee airmen involved in the war, and saying it was safe to be in the plane because she was with him. But he's not mentioned in any of our history books. You have to go to the Tuskegee Airmen's history to find out about Charles. He built a plane himself, flew it across country using road maps.
That's extraordinary, to steal the word from your title.
And he was I guess you'd say, extraordinary. He finished at the top of his class, valedictorian in his high school class. He didn't go to U City High because at the time it was segregated. But although he grew up on a farm in University City, but none of their books mention his name.
It's interesting, University City is home to a big chunk of that St. Louis Walk of Fame that goes down Delmar. And here's somebody who should clearly be on this. Why do you think this guy's story has been lost to the current generation?
Well, it's lost to the old generation, too. Also, and we teach what we've been taught. We value what we know. And if you don't know something, you don't value it. And our goal is to make names of individuals known so they will be valued when we talk about history.
Well, this book just does a terrific job of that. And one of the chapters that really stood out to me is the chapter about York. This was an explorer who accompanied Lewis and Clark. And I feel like in recent time, we've spent a lot more attention talking about Sacagawea and what she brought to that journey. We still don't hear much about York. John Sr., why do you think that is?
I think we don't know. And that's intentional. A lot of effort has gone into hiding African Americans' contributions. If you look at the turn of the century, we did not talk about contributions. We degraded the African American, made them less valued in our history, which means it's easy to sell poor information and untrue history. And that's about a lot of ethnic groups. We don't.
And it's interesting with this story of York, who was there on that expedition with Lewis and Clark. As you say in this book, after the expedition, he asked William Clark for his freedom. That request was denied. It's also something where we might look at William Clark differently, realizing that he would do that to somebody who went through that journey with him.
I think that has as much to do with it as the hiding York's contributions. The behavior of Clark was shameful, absolutely disgraceful, and inexcusable. And his behavior afterwards, and the last days of trying to cover up and say that York didn't even want to be free, that he seemed to have deemed it as a curse, and he was lost without Clark's guidance. It was, it doesn't shine well. It doesn't shine a positive light on Clark at all. It's, as I said, if you look into it, I think the reason to cover it up is much to erase York as it was to erase Clark's behavior.
It's interesting. There's so many extraordinary people in this book, and reading about it, it's a joyful experience in some ways, but it's also a very sad experience in many ways because so many of these lives took sad turns, like the turn of York we're just talking about, where he was denied his freedom. I'm also thinking of this chapter with Lloyd Gaines, which I found very striking. This was somebody who filed suit to be allowed to go to the University of Missouri Law School. He won the lawsuit, and then rather than let him in, they set up an alternative law school just to keep him out. And then he suffers this tragic death. I mean, this chapter, John Sr., it was difficult to read because it was so tragic in every way.
I went to school with his nephew. No one knows what happened to him. They have no clue of what happened to Lloyd Gaines. But those who thought it was a bad idea to have the law school, they called it a Jim Crow law school. But the instructors taught the students to be civil rights attorneys. And Margaret Bush Wilson, who was a graduate of Lincoln Law School, wrote the papers for the Shelley versus Kramer case for her father, who was the realtor in that case. And that was a case that changed housing all across America. It did away with race-restricted covenant. So it had a national impact.
So this is such a sad story of what happened to Lloyd Gaines. As you say, nobody knows what happened to him. He was in Chicago. He left the fraternity house where he was staying to buy some stamps. He disappeared. As you say in the book, he was never heard from again. And this terrible story of him being kept out of this law school. But as you say, there's some good that comes out of this law school that was formed just to keep him out of the University of Missouri Law School. John Sr., are you able to sort of see the silver lining in some of these short chapters that if you look at the sweep of history, there's a bigger story of progress here?
Oh, I think so. We've come a long ways. The journey is a long journey, but I think we will make it. I hope we don't do like the Moors in Spain. It took them 500 years to get things worked out. We're a young country, but we're becoming more diverse. I have faith in the young people. They don't have the baggage that their parents bring with them. A lot of the older people have invested a lot into racism and hatred. And then we tell them, that's all wrong. You mean to tell me my mother was wrong, my father was wrong, my minister's wrong, I moved 4 times to get away from people, and you tell me I did all that for nothing? I have too much invested in those feelings to give it up. Young people don't have those vested interests. And that's where the hope comes.
You feel like the younger generation can move forward in a way They are. John Jr., do you see that as well? You're a school teacher, so you're there with young people.
I do, but I also think that if you don't know your history, you're kind of doomed to repeat it. There are a number of things that come in that aren't necessarily baggage, but the way people are portrayed on screen, the way people are portrayed in music, in books, images are important. And I think that a number of negative stereotypical things, influences are still out there. And without some sort of course correction to kind of steer away from it, we're doomed to buy into it consciously or unconsciously. I think there's a lot of unconscious bias that is in media, in books, in our music, and in the classroom that has to be dealt with. And hopefully projects like this one will kind of mitigate some of the negative influences that are out there by shining some light and some truth on it. The more we know about people's contributions, the better off we are. I think that a number of things get buried to present a certain narrative. And it also hides a certain, as I was trying to say before with Clark, it also hides a lot of guilt and a lot of things, a lot of negative things that it contributed to where we're the position that we're in now. It covers racism, covers up racism, and covers up ill deeds. And so that's another reason why I think things get buried. My father and I were talking about the case of Celia, who is in the book, who went to somebody who isn't talked about. But she had a prominent case for women's rights, of all things, back in the 1840s. The law had stated that no woman could be taken advantage of, regardless of her condition, whether she be a slave or whether she be free. And so when you have a 14-year-old girl who's purchased by this supposedly upright member of the community, who is 60, and within hours of her purchase, he begins to rape her and continuously sexually assaults her, leading into having her bearing him 2 children, and she's pregnant with a third when she has had enough, and asked to be left alone. And he refused and tried to force himself on her, and she kills him.
Yeah, that chapter is harrowing, and she ends up being hanged for it.
Right.
Yes, after she was pregnant, and they waited till after she had delivered the baby, which was stillborn, before they hung her. Otherwise, they would have tried to have executed her right away. But they delayed her execution so that they would be able to reap some benefit by having the child.
So this is some really dark history. That chapter was gripping, but it's a hard chapter to read. But you feel like that's a chapter, John Jr., that we have to read, that this is an important history for all of us to look at and not flinch from.
I think that if you don't address it, then people say it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. That's one of the nice things that's going on, that I like about citizen journalists today, and the Karen movement, the Karens that are getting caught. There are people that, this could not possibly happen, or the police couldn't possibly respond this way, or neighbors couldn't possibly do that or the other. And then once the evidence is there, through cell phone reporters of sorts, then people are forced to come to grips with it.
And this book, this can have the same impact. You're forcing people to come to grips with the history of this country.
I don't necessarily think it's trying to force people to do it, but I think people may choose to ignore it. Mm-hmm. but it isn't. So it's not forced upon, but it's there.
And now here it is, this history in this book. John Sr., this has now been a project that you've worked on across a decade. What's the one thing that you'd want to leave the reader with after they're done with this volume, the new second edition?
Well, I think with young people, I'd like for them to see what others have done in spite of the capping condition they had to work under and live under. Dreams are possible. You just have to believe. And don't let some of the obstacles that you're facing get in your way.
Well, John Wright Sr., I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations on the second edition of this book.
Well, thank you for having us.
And John Wright Jr., thank you so much for joining us as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And this book, again, this is Extraordinary Black Missourians, Pioneers, Leaders, Performers, Athletes, and Other Notables Who've Made History. The second edition is available now from Reedy Press. You can find a link on our website. That's stlpublicradio.org.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.